The company had gone out to explore a trail cut earlier by Sergeant Vower native scouts. The company radio man reported they had made contact with the 7th Marines and learned that a large Japanese force has escaped a marine trap the night before and probably was moving toward Binyu 10 minutes later. Company C called Carlson they had found Japanese soldiers, in force armed with machine guns, mortars and 20 mm cannon 3 miles southwest of Binyu. They could use some help. Carlson moved his 3 other companies around to attack and surround the Japanese at 7 o'clock. Company E spotted 2 companies of Japanese troops crossing the Metapa River from various reports. Carlson deduced that the Japanese had split their force and were preparing to make a surprise attack on the rear of the 7th Marines SEA Company ran into a Japanese bivouac in the woods on the edge of a broad field. The Japanese reacted quickly to the appearance of the 1st Marine and soon had the company pinned down in the field under machine gun mortar and 20 mm cannon fire. The company brought up its own mortars and retreated under their covering fire. When Colonel Carlson arrived at the scene at 4:30 a.m. in the afternoon, he found his whole company disorganized. He sent C Company into reserve and brought in E Company to fight the Japanese. He radioed for air support, and just at dusk 2 American dive bombers appeared and dropped bombs in the woods. As darkness fell, the Japanese moved out. Carlson suspected that they might, and sent a patrol across the field when the raiders reached the woods and found the enemy gone. Carlson then moved the whole force back to Binyu. Arriving at 11 o'clock that night, Colonel Carlson made some changes in his command, relieving the commanders of C and D companies and promoting men in the field on the afternoon of November 12th. The 11th Air Fleet made its move. 25 torpedo bombers supported by 80 fighters attacked the American ships, bringing supplies to Guadalcanal. The Marine Navy and Army pilots of the Cactus Air Force were ready, and 20 of 4 Fs and 8 P-39S engaged the Japanese and drove them off, shooting down a claimed 16 bombers and 5 fighters, with a loss of 3 F-4Fs and 1 P-39 on the morning of the 12th American planes raided Shortland Island at dawn and bombed the transport ships lying in harbour there, but caused no damage. At 6 o'clock that night. The 11 Japanese Army transports moved south to the edge of Lunga Roads, and waited that night. The battleships Hai and Kirishima were to open Admiral Yamamoto's new drive to capture Guadalcanal with a bombardment of Henderson Field. They were already on their way to Guadalcanal, escorted by 2 divisions of destroyers. 3 American attack cargo ships lay in Lunga Roads that day. Unloading, they had been brought safely down to Guadalcanal by Admiral Scott's task force. A second group of transports under Admiral Turner was on its way to Lear, guarding by Admiral Daniel Callahan's task force of cruisers and destroyers. The Enterprise was still under repair at New Mia, so she could not help in this difficult time when Japanese and Americans were vying to see who could land the most men on Guadalcanal. But her escort force, including 2 battleships and 4 destroyers, was detached and went to sea under Rear Admiral Ching Lee that afternoon of November 12th. American and Japanese warships were milling around in Guadalcanal waters, each trying to keep track of the other, each trying to defend its own landings and break up the enemy's. Admiral Turner's information suggested that the Japanese had 2 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 12 destroyers coming down to Guadalcanal to defend the American transports. Admiral Kagan had only 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers and 8 destroyers, but they would have to do the job if it was to be done at all. By evening it was apparent that the night of November 12th would be the night of crisis rear. Admiral Koki Abe was in command of the Japanese force sent down to Guadalcanal on November 12th to bombard Henderson Field early in the afternoon. Admiral Abe had ordered his ships to assume the double half-ring formation the Japanese used to fight off air attack 5 destroyers, were spread into an arc 5 miles ahead of the cruiser Nagara. 6 other destroyers took the same position relative to the cruiser but closer in the battleships. He and Kirishima came up behind about a mile apart, and as the afternoon wore on, the weather changed from sunny to overcast and then to rain. Admiral Abe ordered a float plane catapulted from the He, but after an hour it had not sent back any message. They moved along at 18 knots into the teeth of a tropical storm, and the rain soon came down so hard that it was difficult for the officers on the bridge of one ship to see the closest vessel. Many of the ship commanders thought Admiral Abe must soon order them to slow down for safety's sake, but Admiral Abe drove them on at 18 knots. They must maintain the speed, he said, to be sure they reached Guadalcanal and began their mission on time. Finally, the scout plane reported more than a dozen enemy warships off Lunga. These were Admiral Callahan's ships, and just then they were in a long column, the destroyers Cushing, Laffey-Stett, and Onon led, and next came the cruisers Atlanta, San Francisco, Portland, Helena, and Juneau. Behind them came the destroyers Aaron Ward, Barton Monson, and Fletcher. This disposition had been adopted because it had been successful for Admiral Scott at the Battle of Cape Esperance. Admiral Callahan and his staff did not know that the basic reason for Scott's success was purely accidental: the crossing of the enemy T when neither force was aware of the other on the night of November 12th. The ship with the most effective radar was the San Francisco, the flagship, but was tucked in the middle of the column, and the destroyers out front had the worst radar of all. At 10 o'clock that night, the transport ships off Lunga were sent over to Tagi for protection, and Admiral Kakan moved up through Lango Channel into Iron Bottom Sound. He was moving toward the rain squall that hid Admiral Abe's ships, although at that hour the American ships were still steaming under clear starry skies. But as they headed north, the weather worsened rapidly. At 10 o'clock, Admiral Abe was in his chart room checking the work of the navigators. He had a message from the army on Guadalcanal weather, now very bad here. He knew that already, because the pilot of the High Scout seaplane had announced that he was going to land at Banville, rather than try to find his ship in the storm below. The storm was going to cause some trouble for the bombardment force if they continued in it. So Admiral Abe decided to get out. He ordered a simultaneous 180 degrees turn by all ships. Then he slowed them to 12 knots that ought to get them clear, and let the southbound squall run on, and they could follow it and carry out the bombardment with the high-explosive, quick-fused shell they had brought to use this night at 11:40 a.m. The rain squall passed by, and a few moments later Admiral Abe ordered the ships to turn 180 degrees again, resuming their original run toward Guadalcanal. But now, under clear skies, there was a difference. The fast run through the storm had caused the ships to separate into two major groups. Thus they ran down until they reached Savo Island, on his flag bridge. Admiral Abe studied the latest messages, and the army on Guadalcanal reported that the weather had cleared, and no enemy ships could be seen off Lunga Banville base, reported that it was sending several float planes to act as observers. Admiral Abe was tortured by indecision. He was only 12 miles offshore if he was to carry out the bombardment mission. The guns should be loaded with the high-explosive Onton shells that were filled with anti-personnel bombs and incendiary charges. If he was to engage other warships, his force should be loading with armor-piercing shells at 1:24 a.m., a radar operator aboard the American cruiser. Helena caught an unusual blip on his screen. It showed up as a trace or long line with another behind it, and the operator was experienced enough to recognize two columns of ships, one behind the other, and he sent out the report 3 minutes later. Admiral Callahan ordered his column of ships to change course to head directly toward the enemy. At 1:30 a.m., the Helena announced that the enemy was on their port bow 9 miles away, steaming at a speed of 23 knots added to the American speed of 18 knots. That meant the two forces were heading for collision at a rate of more than 40 knots. The Americans at long distance had the advantage of their radar, and thus they saw the Japanese before the Japanese saw them. But for some reason Admiral Kagan did not order the ships to open fire, or to fire torpedoes as they came within range aboard the San Francisco. Admiral Kagan was forever calling for ranges and courses, but he gave no orders at 1:42 a.m. Admiral Abe's indecision was ended. A message came from the destroyer. Udachi enemy sighted. A moment later came the call from the He's Mad lookout that he had sighted 4 warships 5 degrees to starboard about 6 m away. The Admiral ordered the bombardment ammunition put down and replaced with armor-piercing shells. Again he agonized should he turn away from the enemy while the change was made, and he decided against it. Had Admiral Kagan ordered his ships to open fire when they came within range, the battle could easily have been over in a few minutes, because the Japanese battleships and cruisers were in no condition to return fire as they changed types of ammunition. But Admiral Callahan came on without firing, and 8 precious minutes were gained by Admiral Abe to change over his ammunition. One of the American difficulties was that by moving in a straight line, the United States ships could only fire forward, that could have been changed immediately by an order from Admiral Callahan turning 90 degrees right or left, and bringing the batteries to bear once again. That way Admiral Callahan would have crossed the T, but he did not. It was 1:45 a.m. before Callahan gave the order to stand by to open fire. At that point, the two forces had virtually overrun each other aboard the Udachi. The crew was astounded to see an American destroyer suddenly bearing down on them from the darkness. They did not fire, but only because they were not yet finished with the transfer of ammunition. The Americans were equally confused, and Lieutenant Commander Edward N. Parker, captain of the Cushing, turned left. When he sighted the Udachi, he thus narrowly avoided a collision with the enemy ship, but also led the American line in a confusing maneuver that had the United States ships nearly piling up on one another as they turned sharply to 315 degrees. The HEI searchlight began probing the night, and suddenly it fell on the bridge of the American cruiser Atlanta, 2.5 miles away. The port wing of the Atlanta's bridge was suddenly lighted up as brightly as if it were noon, and the gunnery officer of the Atlanta waited no longer for an order. "Commence firing, counter-illuminate," he shouted. The range was not quite a mile, and the Atlanta began to fire. Half a minute later, he returned the fire at almost point-blank range. One shell landed on the bridge of the Atlanta, killing Admiral Scott, and all but one other man on the bridge. Just then came the command from the flagship to open fire. So close was the he to at least 4 American destroyers that the American 5-in guns were effective. Some of the shells went over the ship and threatened the destroyer Mukazi on the other side. The Atlanta was hit many times by shells from the high, but she was finished by the Japanese destroyers, which began launching torpedoes with their usual efficiency. One or more of them hit the Atlanta and stopped her cold in the water. She was out of the fight. The destroyer Cushing fired 6 torpedoes at the HE, but all of them missed. Another sign of the great difference between Japanese and American night fighting techniques, and of the superiority of Japanese destroyer crews as torpedo artists. The Leahy, coming alongside he also fired torpedoes, and these bounced off the battleship sides. But at close quarters, the Leahy machine gunners, the he's bridge-killing Captain Suzuki, and several men and wounding Admiral Abe. The Cushing and the Leahy were quickly reduced to wreckage by the big guns of the battleship. The 3rd and 4th ships in the American column were the Stet and the O'Bannon. The captain of the Stet replied to Admiral Caller's order that odd-numbered ships fire to starboard by swinging her guns around. As he did this, the main battery director picked up a Japanese cruiser through his binoculars. She was 4,500 yards away. The word came from the flagship, "Get the big ones first. Commence firing, give them hell, boys, the Sterrets." "Permission this time, commence firing." A torpedoman turned the switches. The Japanese ship swung around on a course paralleling the Stets. A salvo from the American ship's 5-in guns struck the Japanese ship's bridge, ripping it open from pilot house to waterline. The hull glowed with fire, and the destroyer took a list to port. There was no use wasting another torpedo on her torpedo officer. McWhorter decided when the torpedoes struck, they lifted the destroyer out of the water. "Oh!" came a shout from somewhere up forward aboard the Stet, and then the Japanese ship was afire from end to end, and she shuddered and plunged to the bottom. The Stet passed the dying destroyer. A beam, not more than 600 yards off the burning ship, lit up the area, and in the flames McWhorter could see other burning ships, some of them American, and the fire illuminated the Stet for some Japanese marksman for a heavy caliber. Salvo hit the destroyer's No. 3 gun and the ammunition handling room below a ball of fire 30 feet in diameter. Rose to the top of the gun mount, MWhorter heard terrifying screams from the gun crew and saw 2 men, their clothes on fire, tumbling backward out of the gun mount. To the deck, Captain Coward rang up full speed ahead, and then stopped by this jackrabbit hopping. He confused the Japanese marksman, and the proof of it was projectiles splashing fore and after of the ship. The cruiser Nagara suddenly put 2 parachute flares up, and by their light the last 6 ships of the American column were clearly outlined. Captain Tamichi Hara of the Amatsuki made ready to fire torpedoes on this Japanese ship. That task was regarded as too important to leave to a junior officer, and he made the calculations himself. Hara waited until his torpedo officer was impatient, and they moved closer to the enemy until they were less than 2 mil apart, and then Hara gave the order ready, torpedoes fire 8. Torpedoes rushed out of their tubes. Just then the destroyer Udachi nearly collided with the American destroyer Aaron Ward, which turned sharply to avoid a crash. The United States destroyer Barton, just behind the Aaron Ward, had to come to a UL stop to avoid hitting her sister ship. The change worked perfectly for Commander Hara. 2 pillars of flame shot up from the side of the Barton. She broke in 2 and sank in seconds. The Aaron Ward got in the way of the Kirishima's guns and was blasted. She sank later, and Commander Hara turned, looking for new game back to the west. He could see that he wreathed in flames. He headed toward her. Then, in a minute, saw gun flashes to port that illuminated a 4-masted ship and an American cruiser. It was the cruiser Juno, and Hara attacked her torpedoes. "Ready," he shouted. "Target 70 Ds to port torpedoes. Ready, hold it. The target is moving 4 torpedoes this time," and the 4 torpedoes left their tubes. And 3 minutes later, a torpedo struck the cruiser Juno and sent up a spout of water. The battleship Kirishima stood off about half a mile from the high and fired at any American ships she saw. None seemed to fire at her until late in the battle, for she was hit only once by an 8-inch shell from a cruiser. The American flagship San Francisco began firing on an enemy ship, but then was illuminated by a Japanese searchlight, and the Kirishima began firing on her for some reason or other. Admiral Kagan then ordered a ceasefire, and the San Francisco stopped shooting, but her enemies did not. A destroyer came down the side and fired on the bridge. So did 2 other ships in a minute. So many shells hit that bridge that they virtually wiped it out and killed Admiral Sigan and Captain Casson. Young, the cruiser Portland, began firing on the Japanese, and in TB, an enemy ship fired on her, hitting once with a shell that wounded the executive officer 5 minutes after opening fire. Captain Lawrence Dubose received the ceasefire order but did not believe it. The Portland stopped firing for a few moments, then started again since so many ships were firing at her. Then a torpedo struck, smashed her so hard that a chunk of metal protruded from her side and caused her to turn in circles as she came around. The high came in sight, and the Portland put more shells into the battleship. The American cruiser Helena was very lucky that night. She began firing in line and fired on many enemy ships, but she was scarcely hurt. Only a small shell from a destroyer passed through her superstructure and did minimal damage. The Juno was last in the American column of cruisers. She opened fire, but unfortunately on the Helena she stopped at Admiral Callahan's orders, and just then a torpedo from Amatsuki smashed into her side, broke her keel, and put her out of action. The Juno was dead in the water after the destroyer Barton sank the Monson, which was right behind her, fired a torpedo. Salvo of 5 fish at the Kirishima and all missed star shells began lighting up the ship, and the captain, who for some reason believed the star shells were American, switched on his lights and made a perfect target for another Japanese destroyer and the Nagara, and in 2 minutes the Monson was burning, and out of the fight the destroyer Fletcher was last in the American line, and when her captain saw the Barton blow up and the Monson burning, he turned away from the battle to get out of the line of fire, intending to come in and launch his torpedoes from a new approach. But when the High turned away and the Kirishima followed the Japanese destroyers and cruisers, BR broke off the attack and steamed north with their battleships. The fight was over 15 minutes after it began, and the Japanese retired northward except for the destroyer. Akatsuki, which had sunk 5 miles south of Savo Island, the destroyer Udachi, suddenly erupted in flame and smoke. An internal explosion, perhaps triggered by an apparently dud shell blown up by some minor fire, shook her, and in a minute she was stopped dead. The destroyers Murasame, Matsukaze, Samidare, and Ikazuchi were all damaged, but not too seriously. Samide stopped to take the survivors off Udachi, and the Japanese went on. As the light of morning came, the waters of Guadalcanal were full of smoke, and several burning vessels could still be seen. Down south, close to Lunga Point, was the Atlanta, which was kept afloat only by constant work of the pumps. She was taken in tow that morning by the tug bobbling under tow. She was attacked by 1-2-engine Betty bomber. The crew of Atlanta opened up their remaining guns to fire on the plane and drove it away as they moved toward Cucum. The crew fired with rifles at every head that appeared in the water, until the captain pointed out that they might well be killing American survivors instead of Japanese. Finally, at 2 in the afternoon, the Atlanta was anchored off Kum, but it soon became apparent that she could not be kept afloat long, and there were no dry docks in Guadalcanal, so that night the Atlanta was scuttled in deep water 3 miles off Lunga Point. The Portland had lost her steering in the fight, and not much could be done with her until the afternoon when the bobolink came back from the Atlanta tow and took on Portland. She was brought into Tagi Harbour early on the morning of November 14th. The Helena San Francisco, Juno, Owanon, Sterrett and Fletcher set out for the safety of the new herders. In November it was a sorry procession. San Francisco with her upper works shot away, and the others limping with scores of wounds among them, but they could make 18 knots, and they moved through a quiet sea towards safety. The Sterrett's firepower was down to 2 guns, and she had taken 11 hits and survived. The Owanon's sound gear was disabled, among other damage, and the cruisers seemed like floating wreckage, but they moved on under the Helena's Captain G.C. Hoover, who was made the tactical officer in charge by the deaths of 2 admirals that night, before the O'Bannon went ahead to send a message to Admiral Fitch asking for air cover. Captain Hoover had seen a message announcing the presence of 2 Japanese carriers. They were not nearby. None of the ships was in, conditioned to be alert for attack. Most of the men aboard were concerned about survival. The treatment of the wounded and the repair of emergency facilities around noon. Lieutenant McWhorter went on the bridge of the Stet for a condition read air alert that did not materialize. He was watching the destroyer's signal man using his signal light box to send a message to the Juno. Suddenly he saw an enormous explosion next. To the Juno, and the whole ship was hidden by a sphere of flame. The signalman aboard the Juno was thrown high into the air, and McWhorter saw the man tumbling around in a hail of debris. Then the smoke obscured the view, and when it cleared there was no more Juno but a column of smoke rising 1,000 feet in the sky. She had gone down with her 700 men. No one in the convoy thought there could be a survivor, and they steamed on to get away from the submarine E-26 that had delivered the fatal torpedo to the ship's magazine. But the next morning a search plane sighted 100 men still alive in the water. It took the rescuers too long to reach them, and when a PBY finally arrived, the number of survivors was down to 6, and a destroyer picked up a single survivor on a raft. A week later, 3 men pad a raft to a small island whose name they did not even know, where friendly natives saved them. That was the end of one light cruiser. The failure of the rescue attempt was one of the grimmer stories of the American war effort. Perhaps the stricken ships of Captain Hu's convoy could be forgiven for steaming on rather than searching for the submarine, driving it down with depth charges and looking for survivors. But as so often happened at this phase of the war, the communications system failed miserably. A B-17 came over the damaged flotilla, and the ships made contact and asked the aircrew to relay a rescue request to Admiral Holly. It never arrived at Holly's headquarters back in the slot. The destroyers Cushing and Monson continued to burn late on the afternoon of November 13th. They sank the Aaron Ward dead in the water, was spotted in the morning by the HE, which lay just north of Savu Island, guarded by 3 Japanese destroyers. The High began effing on the Aaron Ward and continued until the search planes of the Cactus Air Force came over and attacked her. Then she stopped, and she would be too busy thereafter to pay any attention to one crippled American destroyer. The Aaron Ward sat in the water until afternoon, when a tug hooked up and towed her towards safety. The cruiser Portland, which could steam only in circles, found the crippled Japanese destroyer Udachi that morning and sank her before she was towed off. The He's ordeal, serious as it had been during the night, had only begun at 6 o'clock in the morning. The first strike of dive bombers left Henderson Field. and they scored one hit amidships and a near miss. An hour later, a group of 4 Marine torpedo bombers appeared and delivered the first torpedo attack ever made by Marine pilots. They put one torpedo into the high just after 10 a.m. 6 more dive bombers appeared and dropped their bombs, but scored nothing closer than a near-miss. 6 F-4Fs strafed the ship a few minutes later, and the Marine torpedo planes came back and put another torpedo. Had been able to send down a number of Zero fighters to cover the HEI, and they engaged in air fights with the American planes. The F-4Fs claimed to have shot down 7 Zeros late in the morning. 9 torpedo bombers from the carrier Enterprise arrived on the scene, and they exploded 3 more torpedoes against the Huai. The 11th Bombardment Group of the United States Army Air Force sent 14 B-7S to bomb the ship. They dropped 56 500-pound bombs, and one of them hit the battleship. It was then 11 o'clock in the morning. A few minutes later, more planes arrived from Henderson Field. 6 dive bombers attacked and scored 3 more hits with 1,000-pound bombs. 6 torpedo planes attacked, and 2 of their torpedoes exploded against the ship. The HYI was still floating, still fighting, although at least half her anti-aircraft guns were out, and the inaccuracy of the gunners attested to the casualties she must have taken at 2:35 a.m. The Enterprise torpedo bombers were back again, having landed at Henderson Field, and rearmed they put 3 more torpedoes into the high, and just before sunset the Marine dive bombers were back again too, and they made one near miss on a destroyer in the hay screen. That night the High lay low in the water, her captain and her admiral were wounded, and 450 of her crew had been killed. Admiral Yamamoto ordered the battleship Kirishima to take the High in tow and bring her back to True, but Admiral Abe and Captain Nishida flatly disregarded the direct order and scuttled the High. She was sunk that night, and the survivors set off north toward True in the destroyers. When Admiral Yamamoto learned of the scuttling of the battleship, he was furious and called a court of inquiry. Admiral Abe and Captain Nishida were both ordered to retire, which meant go home to live in Japan in Igni for the rest of their lives. So the battle the Japanese called the Third Battle of the Solomon Sea, and the Americans called the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, came to an end. Admiral Abe had failed in his primary mission, which was to pulverize Henderson Field. He had paid for that dearly the next day in the sinking of his flagship, a loss which would not have been accomplished without the efforts of planes from Henderson Field. The Japanese combined plan to smash Henderson Field and then take it with troops of the 38th Division was upset. As for the Americans, they had taken a dreadful beating in destruction and damage of ships. 4 destroyers sunk or scuttled. 2 cruisers sunk, 3 cruisers disabled, and 2 destroyers disabled. Admiral Yamamoto was not content with anger at Admiral Abe for his failures. The chief of the combined fleet was determined that his plan would not fail in the early morning hours. When the He was still afloat, Yamamoto ordered Admiral Cond, who was then 500 ema east of Rabaul, to rescue the He and then go on to bombard Henderson Field on the night of November 14th. Admiral Tanaka and his 11 destroyers had been scheduled to bring the 6 Army troop transports and 5 cargo ships to Guadalcanal on the night of November 12th under cover of the shelling of the Abe Squadron. But when the shelling was abandoned in favor of battle, Yamamoto gave orders that Admiral Tanaka was to come back to Shortland, and he did. The move was postponed until November 14th, which was to give Admiral Kondo time to soften up Henderson Field on the night of November 13th. Louis the Lay appeared over Guadalcanal. It was 1:30 a.m. in the morning, and as the men around the airfield listened to the droning of his hateful engine, they knew what was coming next. The green flares appeared over the field, and the heavy cruisers Suzuya and Maya stood offshore and fired 1,000 rounds of 8 in ammunition. These shells were the special thin-skinned projectiles the Japanese had developed for anti-personnel bombardment, filled with fragmentation bombs and incendiaries. This morning the shells missed. The installations on the bomber strip at Henderson Field but did much damage in the cow pasture. 2 F-4Fs were set afire by the incendiaries, and 15 others were damaged by the fragmentation shrapnel. The Japanese cruisers were nagged that night by a pair of American PT boats that came out from Tulagi and attacked repeatedly, no matter how much they were discouraged by fire from the cruiser's smaller guns and machine guns. They did not sway the course of events, however, and the cruisers retired at the appointed hour, when morning came. It was apparent that the cruisers had not done very well. The regular morning search by the dive bombers went off on schedule, and at 6:30 a.m. reported back by radio that they had found a force of 4 cruisers and 3 destroyers 150 miles west of Guadalcanal. These were the ships of Admiral Mawa, the Chokai Kinugasa Suzuya, and Maya all-heavy cruisers, the light cruisers Isuzu and Tenryu, and 6 destroyers. The search planes had undercounted the first United States strike, was launched at 7:15 a.m. and included 5 dive bombers and 6 torpedo bombers. The dive bombers attacked the Maya and hit her on the port side, starting fires. The torpedo bombers attacked the Cougar and put 4 torpedoes into the big cruiser she was burning heavily. As the American planes left the area just at this time, search planes from the carrier Enterprise also discovered the Mawa force. 2 search planes circled the Japanese ships as they waited for an airstrike. Every 15 minutes they sent messages about the Japanese movements. They stayed up there until they began to run low on gas. Then they attacked the cruiser that was leaving a noticeable oil slick behind it. Kinugasa and each plane's bomb struck, setting new fires. The bombers then headed for Henderson Field, nearly out of gas. A few minutes later, 2 more American bomber pilots from the Enterprise discovered the Mawa ships and attacked. They were green pilots who had not even thought about sending a report. One of them survived the attack. The other did not. Neither did any damage at about 10:30 a.m. 16 more planes from the Enterprise encountered the Japanese ships and dove on them with bombs. They did serious damage to the cruiser Isuzu and more to the Kinugasa later that morning. The Kinugasa sank early, on November 14th. The Japanese transports sailed with their destroyer escorts out in front, and on both sides of the formation, Admiral Tanaka LED'd them in his flagship Haseo at 11 knots at dawn on the 14th. The flotilla was attacked by American B-7S and carrier bombers. The attackers did no damage and were shot down in mid-EM morning when the large dive bomber force of the Enterprise was sinking. The Kinugasa Admiral Tanaka saw the planes from his flagship as they flew by to the southwest. The weather was spotty, heavy cloud interspersed with clear sky, and perhaps the American bombers did not see the transports. More probably, the pilots preferred to attack warships rather than transports. The results of the American air attacks were soon relayed to Admiral Tanaka. He had expected the support of the Mawa ships to cover the landing of the 38th Division, but Mawa was going back to Shortland, with 1 ship sunk and 3 damaged. He could not carry out his missions satisfactorily. 4 days earlier, Tanaka had word of the concentration of American naval forces in the Guadalcanal area, including the movement of the American carrier force, and he expected trouble, but nothing quite like what he was to get. Admiral Holly was out to get those transports, and the Japanese attempt to reinforce the troops on the islands to do so. He had sent Admiral Kincaid with the Enterprise, and they had helped smash Ma's group. High had also detached Admiral Lee's 2 battleships and 4 destroyers and sent them to the transports and sent them all together. The Japanese supply force consisted of 11 army transports and cargo ships, and they had all the heavy equipment of the 38th Army Division aboard. At 11 o'clock, 19 dive bombers and 7 torpedo bombers from Henderson Field found the transports as the planes came into view. Admiral Tanaka ordered the destroyers to raise a smoke screen and the transports to take evasive action. But the pilots were not confused. One group of dive bombers selected one column of ships, and a second group took another column, the Sard Maru, which was carrying troops, and the staff of the 38th Division was crippled by bombs. The bombers put 2 1,000-pound bombs into another transport, and the worst damage was done by the torpedo bombers, which sank the Canberra Maru and the Niagara Maru. The Japanese custom of naming ships after foreign cities and geographical points indicates Japan's pre-war preoccupation with foreign trade after the American PLS had left Admiral Tanaka supervise the rescue of survivors from the 2 sunken transports and dispatched the Saddam Maru with the destroyers Amagiri and Shizuki back to Shortland later that morning of November 14th. Tanaka's ships were attacked by Cactus Air Force bombers, which sank the Brisbane Maru. A little later, more bombers came over and attacked. This time they scored several hits on the remaining transports and cargo ships, but did not sink any B-7S from Espiritu Santo, repeated the performance early in the afternoon. The Enterprise launched her last dive bombers for another attack, and then retired south, having told the bomber pilots to land on Henderson Field. By this time, Admiral Tanaka had called for and secured air cover. Another bombing attack from Henderson came over the ships and was jumped by Zeros, but 8 F-4Fs attacked the Zeros and kept them away from the bombers, which sank the Shinagawa Maru and the Arizona Maru, and to Admiral Tanaka the day was endless. An hour after those last 2 transports were sunk, more American bombers appeared, B-7 and dive bombers. They attacked without success. But then, just before dark, more bombers came in, and this time they sank the Nakum Maru. The destroyer Suzukaze took off the survivors of the 7,000-ton transport, and then she sank just as the sun was setting as she went down. The transport train was again under American attack, but in the growing dusk no hits were scored. So the day's work was done. The Japanese had set out with 11 transports and cargo ships filled with men and supplies. By nightfall, 6 of the ships had been sunk, and 1 was limping back to Shortland. About 400 of the troops had been killed in the attacks, but 5,000 had been rescued by Tanaka's destroyers. Those destroyers were still picking up survivors at nightfall, but Admiral Tanaka and his men were nearly exhausted. His lasting memories of that day were the sight of bombs wobbling down from B-7S dive bombers, screaming toward the ships, pulling up and launching bombs, with everyone either hitting a ship and starting a fire, or splashing and sending a column of water high, and the sharp list that meant another ship was going down. He might have turned back, but his orders were explicit, and he had rescued almost all the troops who were now aboard the destroyers. They must be delivered to Guadalcanal. So as darkness fell, Admiral Tanaka left the rescue destroyers behind, regrouped his flagship, and the 3 remaining destroyers of Division 15 around the 4 transports, and at 13 knots turned toward Guadalcanal, knowing that he could not arrive at the appointed hour, but would come to the island almost at sunup on November 15th. On the afternoon of November 14th, Admiral Tanaka received a message that shook his resolve. A Japanese search plane reported that 4 enemy cruisers and 4 destroyers were steaming at high speed east of Guadalcanal. He knew they must be after his ships, and he hesitated. The 8th Fleet was supposed to cover his arrival at Guadalcanal, but Admiral Mawa was far away and not. Confound her crew with an electrical failure, and her effectiveness was reduced to almost nothing. At 11:30 a.m., 3 separate groups were fighting in the channel between Savu Island and Guadalcanal. The Japanese destroyer Ayanami had been badly damaged by American shells 5 minutes later. All 4 American destroyers were out of action, and the South Dakota was at least temporarily, so the Walker sank just after this, and her depth charges exploded beneath her survivors, cutting their number drastically. The Bainom limping along went through the survivors, but was too badly hurt to help. The Preston was ablaze internally, and she sank a few minutes later. The Gwyn came through that water moments afterward, and was further damaged by the Preston's exploding depth charges. The Washington Unhurt was speeding into battle. Her sailors stood by the rails and threw life rafts to the men in the sea as she hurried on. The South Dakota regained power at 11:45 a.m., but was immediately beset by more trouble. A blast of one of her guns set fire to airplanes on the fantail catapults. The next salvo blew the planes overboard. The South Dakota was then the object of more than 30 Japanese torpedoes. Somehow they all missed, but a few moments later she came under the enemy searchlights, and the whole Japanese bombardment force fired on her. She was taking serious punishment. Admiral Lee had been tracking a large target for some time, but feared it might be the South Dakota, and so refrained from opening fire. Then the Japanese turned on their searchlights, and he saw that it was an enemy battleship. The Washington began to fire on the Kishima. The Japanese ships concentrated on the South Dakota with guns and torpedoes. The Washington fired rapidly, and soon the Kishima was wrecked, her steering gone, her upper works destroyed, and blazing the South Dakota and the Washington also fired on the Otago and Taka guided by the enemy searchlights. But soon the South Dakota was out of it. Her radar knocked out one main battery turret damaged, and many casualties. She moved out of the fight just after midnight on November 15th. Admiral Lee turned north, and the Japanese hastened to respond. Their task was to save the transport, and the Washington was going for them. In the next hour, Admiral Lee moved west to draw the Japanese warships away from his cripples. The Gwin escorted the Bolis Benam to Espiritu Santo. The Benam never made it. She was abandoned later, and sunk by gunfire. Admiral Lee had concluded that the Japanese had turned their transport sports around, and so he headed south, and was joined by the South Dakota Admiral Kondo, abandoned his plan of bombardment, and scuttled the Kishima northwest of Savu Island, then headed north. The destroyer Ayanami had been badly damaged, and she too was scuttled that day, while the battle proceeded. Admiral Tanaka turned his force of transports and destroyers around. He instructed his 3 escorting destroyers, those unencumbered by survivors, to join the battle. But by the time they moved, it was all over. 2 of them fired torpedoes at the Washington. But then she was P. He turned back to complete his mission. The landing of the reinforcements at Guadalcanal, and he headed for Tassafaronga. The plan had called for him to land the troops from the transports between midnight and 2 o'clock in the morning, which would give the soldiers plenty of time to get ashore and inland, and the ships a chance to get away from the slot before morning came, with the expected onslaught of American B.S. Petty Officer Tsuji, was a member of the Imperial Japanese Navy, serving aboard the Army transport Yamura Maru, one of the transports assigned to move the 38th Division's troops and heavy equipment to Guadalcanal. Tsuji and his best friend, Petty Officer Racerson. The voyage began, as had so many others. They and their army transport had participated in the invasions of Malaya-Burma, and the Dutch East Indies in earlier and more prosperous times for the Japanese army. But as the ship loaded in Java, there was no way of knowing that this voyage was going to be any different from the others. Even as the ship stopped at the Shortlands to join the convoy led by Admiral Tanaka Tsuji and his companions remained confident. The 38th Division was just another unit of army troops off to another victory. It seemed Admiral Tanaka knew that the plan was no good at this point. It was far too late, so he decided to run the transports ground. It was unprecedented to voluntarily destroy 4 transports, so he consulted higher authority. Admiral Mawa said absolutely not. Admiral Kondo said go ahead and do it. And so Tanaka did. The convoy came down just as dawn was breaking, and Tanaka issued the orders. The transport captains ran their ships into the beach, and when Admiral Tanaka saw them grinding ashore, he turned and took his destroyers to the slot as fast as possible, hoping to avoid the American air search of the morning and the expected bombings. But as the ships came down the slot just before dawn on November 15th, they were harried by Allied bombers, and some of the vessels were hit on the lower deck of an army transport. The seamen were hardly party to Admiral Tanaka's plans, but as the ships neared Guadalcanal, the Admiral's decision had to be made known: run ground. It was unheard of in the ever-victorious Japanese army, but that was what was to happen, and suddenly the 6 transports were off Key Point, and the unthinkable was on them. American dive bombers and fighters were zooming all around the ships, and torpedo planes were coming in low to drop their fish, when Tsuji and his friends saw that the captain of their ship was indeed heading straight into the beach. They stopped in their tracks and began to pray as if the hour of our death were arranged. Tsuji wrote in his diary, as Tsuji prayed he heard and saw the bombs falling around his ship, and he saw the water spout as the bombs struck just off the bow and the explosion. The surge of fire and smoke, the mangled steel, and bodies thrust upward on the transport next to his own, as they sped for the beach aboard Yamur Maru, the shrapnel from high-explosive bombs made a pattern on the deck that reminded Tsuji of rice grains on a threshing floor. It was all very unreal for no reason. Tsuji thought of his last leave in Tokyo just weeks before, as the ships had put in at Tokyo Bay for oil and provisions. His prayer to Kanon, the goddess of mercy, finished, Tsuji gave himself to the memory as he waited for the ship to beach. He spoke to Rakusen of his thoughts, and they laughed nervously together. "You remember how you paid for everything in Tokyo, because I was broke," Tsuji said, And how sick I got on sake in that joint in the Ginza, Rozon laughed. Next time it's my turn. Right, of course, they both knew it was a brave lie. There would be no next time, ever, ever. Then the ship crashed on the beach, and the captain ordered all ashore, all men ashore. They began climbing down the cargo nets they had thrown over the side. A few brave souls manned hoists as the bombers rode above them, and a few vehicles were taken ashore. But mostly it was men, their rifles, and a few precious bags of rice that went over the sides into the gentle surf, and up onto the beach into the trees beyond. There to wait for orders, they came soon enough. There was only one place to go up the mountain trail built by the pioneer forces. Through the jungle to the main encampment of the Japanese command, slowly in their canvas shoes and wet fatigue uniforms surrounded by soldiers, the sailors began the long hike they climbed all day and into the night. As darkness fell, Tuji noticed a sort of incandescence in the jungle along the trail. Perhaps it was the presence of cannon. Perhaps it was caused by rotting vegetation, but it impressed him deeply and made him think of home and his native village so far away, and also of the month of May with its bright promise it was autumn in Japan. The leaves were turning and the ground would be crisp, not like this sodden dark jungle in its heat. Finally, before dawn, they came to the naval unit station in the inimitable style of the Japanese forces. They had been sent to the naval station, although they were not in any marine or naval troop because they were seamen, not soldiers. Tuji found himself at a construction camp, the pioneer headquarters. Here he would live, and here he would watch his companions join the dead in their shallow graves, beneath the small, crude stone markers that showed where they slept. As morning came, Tuji arose from his blanket on the ground and looked around him. He was sleeping in the pioneer cemetery, as the light came streaming in from the east. He saw colours very much like those of autumn at home, yellow and red leaves on the trees, and then below him on the steep hillside a river of green forest, like the pines of his own Honu Mountains. Dawn brought out the American planes from Henderson Field before 6 o'clock on the morning of November 15th. The American airmen looked down on the grounded Kinugawa Maru, Yamatsuki Maru, Hirakawa Maru, and Yamura Maru from Banville, and the Shortlands Admiral Kusaka put up as many fight as he could to try to protect those transports on the beach. The first American bombing raid scored hits on 2 of the transports, the second half an hour later hit more of them, and a third bombing raid at 7 a.m. in the morning found supplies on the beach and bombed them. 5 more attacks were made on the Japanese ships, and they burned. Admiral Kusaka sent more Zeros that day, but the F-4Fs engaged them over Savo Island and claimed to have shot down 7 planes while losing 1, as darkness fell on November 15th back at Numa. Admiral Hai could claim a clear-cut victory. The Japanese had set out to land 10,000 men on Guadalcanal, plus the heavy equipment, big guns and ammunition of an entire infantry division. Of the total, only 2,000 had actually gotten ashore, with 1,500 bags of rice, which would supply them for 4 days, and 260 rounds for mountain guns, the ammunition dump that was to be destroyed by bombers that same day. The cost to the Japanese had been 2 battleships won, heavy cruiser, 3 destroyers, 11 transports, and about 50 airplanes, plus 6 damaged warships. The Americans, on the other hand, had safely landed the 8th Marine Regiment from 4 transports, which had then retired. They had lost 2 cruisers and 7 destroyers, and suffered serious damage to 3 cruisers and lighter damage to 1 battleship. There was no doubt that it was a costly battle to both sides, but there was no doubt either that the Americans had the best of it, and the outcome would vitally affect the struggle for Guadalcanal. Colonel Carlson's raiders had been in constant contact with the Japanese for a week on November 12th, as the Battle of Guadalcanal developed at sea. He occupied the village of Asaman and discovered that the Japanese had laid out a bivouac area there for at least a battalion, and had carefully marked the assembly points of various units with signs stuck to the trees that day, and the next. Carlson's men ambushed the Japanese time after time. On November 13th, Carlson moved his troops up to Asaman, and from there sent out patrols that ambushed a number of small Japanese units. The 7th Marines and the army troops had worked out a plan to ambush a large Japanese unit, But the enemy got wind of it, and the force swam the Mimia River and made its way up into the hills on the west, so the raiders, having marched across the island, found there was nothing more for them to do on that mission, and Carlson went to Vandergrift's headquarters for a new assignment on November 13th. The Marines captured a number of landing craft and 15 tons of rice, the latter. Hurt for the Japanese were extremely short of supplies indeed, because of the logistical problems. The landing of the 38th Division, without its tanks, big guns, ammunition and supplies, threatened to become a liability. The Americans faced a similar problem on November 16th. Admiral Turner assigned several transports to deliver more troops of the American division to Guadalcanal, and to take in supplies. The Marines and Army troops were critically short of food ammunition, aviation gas bombs and torpedoes at Henderson Field. On the ground, the Marines harried the Japanese almost constantly. The Japanese had broken into many small groups and worked their way back into the jungle. General Kawaguchi personal gear was captured by the raiders near Asaman, but not General Kawaguchi. Several of the forces that had been landed by Admiral Tanaka were regarded by the Americans as of little danger, because those Japanese had been so thoroughly disorganized and deprived of their supplies every day. The Marines patrolled, and if they found Japanese activity, they called for artillery or for air support, and both responded as needed. The control of Henderson Field was making all the difference in the world, as Admiral Yamamoto had surmised weeks before when Colonel Carlson came up to the 1st Division command post and asked for a new job. General Vandergrift gave him one. He and the raiders were to track down and destroy Pistol Pete, the group of Japanese howitzers that fired several times each day on Henderson Field. They were also to find the trail the Japanese had used to get from the Lunga River to the Matano River and set up an ambush by November 18th. General Vandergrift was preparing for another major attack, moving troops across the Matano River west of Point Cruz. The Cactus Air Force found relatively light air opposition, just a few zeros in the air, and 3 of these were shot down by Army P-38S brand-new twin-engine fighter planes for the Pacific Air Forces that had enormous speed and diving capability and immense firepower. These planes had considerable advantage over the Zeros. Except in tight maneuvers, the search planes from Henderson Field found no Japanese shipping in the slot or anywhere near it. The Cactus Air Force was called upon for a few air support missions that day. On November 21, the Americans were moving, but slowly, and against stubborn Japanese resistance. For the next 5 days, operations were limited. A few Japanese were routed along the trails and killed. Machine guns were captured and a few supplies destroyed, but the Americans were not coming to grips with the enemy. A few Japanese bombers came over mostly in 1s and 2s, but instead of striking straight for Henderson Field, as they had for months, they bombed the Marines in their camps, inflicting a few casualties. The Imperial General Staff and Admiral Yamamoto had given up hope of taking Henderson Field through air and sea action. The cost had been prohibitive. The Imperial General Staff still indicated its complete commitment to the capture of Guadalcanal, but if it was to be done, it was going to be accomplished by the army. Finding the Japanese was a major problem from the islanders on Guadalcanal. The Marines learned that there were about 3,000 troops at Rata Bay on the northwest coast of Santa Isabel Island. Were they assembling there to move down to Guadalcanal, a group of 50 Japanese on a barge were reported at Renova near New Georgia, where they headed for Guadalcanal. The Marines suspected a new effort at supply of the Japanese on a piecemeal basis. They were quite right. Admiral Yamamoto and the 17th Army Command at Rabaul were thoroughly distressed by the presence of 10,000 Japanese troops on Guadalcanal, with diminishing resources and no method of supply. They could not supply the troops from the air because the Cactus Air Force was too formidable. They could not supply them by transport. The events of November 14th and 15 had proved that during the 3rd week of November, various methods of supply were attempted. The Americans were not particularly aware of Japanese naval activity off Guadalcanal, but it existed nonetheless at the Shortland base. Tanaka's men sterilized old oil drums and filled them with medical supplies and rice. The drums were roped together. They were loaded aboard a destroyer, and that destroyer made a high-speed passage to Guadalcanal, arrived at night, pushed the drums overboard close to shore, announced by radio that they were there, and sped back to Shortland to gain safety, and to repeat the performance this system had already been tried at New Guinea, where the Japanese forces around Lai were also cut off, and starving another method of supply, particularly at New Guinea but transferred to Guadalcanal as well, was by submarine. The submarines were loaded with food and medicines and then surfaced just offshore late at night to deliver the supplies to Japanese landing boats. There was nothing new in this method. The Germans had used it in World War I. The Americans had used it at Corregidor and at Guadalcanal in those first desperate days. By the end of November, the Japanese on Guadalcanal let it be known that these supply methods were totally inadequate. Japanese headquarters announced that by the end of the month the food would be completely consumed. Actually, all rice and other staples were gone before the end of the month, and the men had begun foraging and eating in wild plants and animals to survive. The sick lists grew longer every day. Admiral Yamamoto, when approached by the army, was aghast to learn of the condition of the troops aboard the Yamato. There was plenty when an army representative visited the flagship to plead for more supplies for the soldiers on Guadalcanal. He was served a dish made of sea bream, a fish dear to the hearts of Japanese, and then broiled sea bream and chilled beer from home. They served Scotch whisky and English cigarettes. There was no way that such delicacies could find their way to the campfires of Guadalcanal. Rice would be enough. On November 27th, Admiral Tanaka was ordered to begin the regular resupply of the soldiers. With all the means at his disposal, 4 destroyers moved into Shortland from Rabaul, loaded with drums of food and medical supplies. The first effort to make the run through the slot would be on November 30th and would employ 8 destroyers. 2 of them would be heavily armed, but the other 6 would sacrifice armament to accommodate more supplies. Most of their torpedoes were unloaded and replaced by drums of food and medicine. Only 1 torpedo remained. For each tube, the quantity of ammunition for the guns was sharply reduced. On November 29th, the flagship Naganami, accompanied by the destroyer Takanami and 6 supply destroyers, set out with Admiral Tanaka in command. The ships sailed south during the night. Tanaka hoped to avoid detection by the Americans. The American air searches were no better than usual, and they did not find the Tanaka force. This deficiency was certainly not due to any shortage of planes. Henderson Field had been heavily reinforced in recent days, and now housed 124 planes, including 8 B-7S. The CBS were extending the bomber strip and laying mast and matting for a mile. The 2 fighter strips were also being matted, so there would be no trouble with mud. The whole American effort had turned around, and while one could not say yet that it was cursed with oversupply, the ability of Admiral Turner to resupply the Marines in the airfield Wasper ed further the Jamestown. A motor torpedo boat tender had been brought down to Tegi, and 15 PT boats were operating out of those. Water's 8 United States destroyers were assigned to regular transport escort duty between the Solomons and Espiritu Santo, and Newa, where the United States was short, was in carriers. The Saratoga was on her way back under Admiral Ramsey, and Enterprise had a new commander after his desertion of the Hornet. In her time of need, Admiral Kincaid had been moved to command of a 5-cruiser task force and was replaced by one of the young Turk rear admirals, who had just been promoted, Rear Admiral Frederick C. Sherman was an airman through and through, not a retreaded battleship commander, as had been most of the task force leaders in the early days of the war. The Americans had the battleships Washington and North Carolina, and soon would have the Indiana. The battleships Maryland and Colorado were in the Fiji, and could come up on command further. There had been an enormous change in outlook of the respective high commands. Admiral Yamamoto was sobered by debt in the efforts to land men on Guadalcanal and the dreadful attrition to his carriers, battleships and destroyers in terms of fleet actions. He had more than held his own. The Japanese had proved themselves superior in the management of battle, and the only serious defeats suffered by the Imperial Navy had been Admiral Gotto's unlucky meeting with Admiral Scott Huon, the engagement. Despite his personal confusion as to the course of events, Admiral Abe's disastrous foray and Admiral Kondo's error, the last naval battle. Yamamoto had another problem. The Japanese Navy's system of pilot training had always been sharply restricted to the best men. When the war began, the Japanese naval pilots were as good as any in the world, as a team far superior to the Americans, but in the battle of attrition beginning with Midway, the trained pilots had been going down one by one, and Japan's training system had not caught up. So Yamamoto was now getting pilots fresh out of training, who too often took their new planes out and were shot down on that first vital mission. Yamamoto was beset by other problems, such as supply, and the inability of the 11th Air Fleet and the carrier force to stand up against the enormous number of planes that the Americans were throwing into the battle. With the arrival of the P-38S, the disparity of fighters grew even greater. The Zero had the advantage of long-range fleetness and maneuverability more and more. However, the stronger armament and superior firepower of the American aircraft was tilting the battle. The same had to be said for the Betty the Bombaro Fall Workhorse that at the beginning of the war had been the finest and most numerous in the Pacific, but the Betty was not totally outstripped by the B-7S and the B-24-4 engine bombers that were starting to come in, so Yamamoto's course was to keep the combined fleet out of major action and preserve the carriers he was under further wraps from the Imperial General Star, and he had thought seriously of committing the Yamato to the battle for Guadalcanal, and that 70,000-ton battleship might have made an enormous difference in the battle for Henderson Field. But Tokyo had indicated that because of her enormous fuel consumption, the best thing the Yamato could do was sit still. The fleet's daily consumption of fuel had gone far beyond pre-war expectations, and now amounted to 10,000 tons. The reserves at the Kura Naval Base had been reduced to 65,000 tons, which was obviously a dangerously low level, and the American submarine menace grew worse each week as the United States submarines sank more tankers, so he kept the Yamato at TR out of action, and he still thought of the war in terms of one more decisive victory, and then the supreme effort to get to the peace table. Since he could not control the Army's activity in his sphere, the battle had to be naval, and he was holding his forces. For that day Admiral Holly was prosecuting the war in the South Pacific with great vigour. He had only one absolute for his officers' fight. If they fought and lost, even if they made errors in judgment, he would not complain if they showed the slightest timidity. He would have them out of his command. If they proved totally inept, he would break them as quick as look at them one day, when a new destroyer commander showed up in Newer Holly, laid that all out for him. Quite probably, if Admiral Callahan had survived the Battle of Guadalcanal, Admiral King would have demanded his head for carelessness and bad planning, but Admiral Hull would have protected him. Go get them was one of Holly's fondest phrases, and every ship commander in the South Pacific knew it even before High began to get. Japanese were sending a force of destroyers and transports to land troops and supplies at Guadalcanal that would arrive on the night of November 30th. Once again, Admiral Nimitz's radio intelligence team had made good use of their mastery of parts of the Japanese naval code. At 11 o'clock that night, the task force sailed on the 600 journey to Guadalcanal. The ships travelled at high speed, 28 knots, on the morning of November 30th. Admiral Tanaka turned east from Banville to confuse the Americans about his purpose. He was upset about the presence of an American plane that seemed to be shadowing him that morning. His ploy worked perfectly, for the pilot never reported his findings not quite as effective as Nimitz's radio intelligence was, the report made by Coast Watcher Mason on the morning of November 30th. From his vantage point he counted the masts of the Japanese ships in Bun Harbor and notified Guadalcanal that 12 destroyers were missing, so Guadalcanal knew someone was on the move, but where they were heading and why was still a mystery. On his trip toward the slot, Admiral Tanaka had word from a Japanese reconnaissance plane of an American force of 12 destroyers and 9 transports, apparently heading for Guadalcanal. He did not want to meet them. His miss was to supply, not to fight, but he prepared for action anyway, and the ships went to ready stations as the sun set. The weather took a turn for the worse. It began to rain, and the stars were blotted out. Tanaka slowed down, but the squall passed over, and the visibility improved. Tanaka speeded up. The American force came out of Indispensable straight early in the evening of November 30th. There they encountered 3 American transports and 5 destroyers heading back toward Espiritu Santo High, ordered 2 of those destroyers to join Admiral Wright, and they took positions at the end of the cruiser column at 11 o'clock. The American task force was in Iron Bottom, Sound, heading for Savu Island. Admiral Tanaka's ships were just passing west of Savu and turning southeast. The Kincaid plan had called for 2 destroyers to move ahead of the main American flotilla, but somehow this had not been done, and so the Americans were deprived of advanced knowledge of the enemy just after 11 o'clock. The American radar picked up a strange blip. This time the Americans were alert. Admiral Wright did not lose a moment in ordering a 40 degrees turn that put the American ships in the column formation he wanted. Then the single blip dissolved like an amoeba into a number of smaller ones, ships in formation heading southeast toward Guadalcanal. In fact, Admiral Tanaka had already given orders for the supply destroyers to be ready to dump their drums, because the current and tide would take them ashore at the Japanese end of the island the ships had slowed to 12 knots and were about a mile offshore. But before Tanaka gave the execute order, 3 enemy planes began circling the Japanese ships. These were the observation float planes that Admiral Wright had sent off earlier from his ships to land at Tagi in order to take off again, as his force neared the island. The Japanese had been throwing up green flares all this time, and Admiral Tanaka hoped the Americans had not sighted them. They had not, because the float planes had been late in arriving, but that matter became totally unimportant seconds later, when a lookout reported enemy ships bearing 1,000 degrees next. Came another report 7 enemy destroyers. The Japanese ships had already broken battle formation. But now Tanaka ordered them to put down the drums and assume their battle stations. There was no time to try to reassemble the usual Japanese battle formation. At 11:15 a.m., the American destroyer commander asked permission of his admiral to break off from the line and make an independent torpedo attack. Admiral Wright hesitated and second-guessed the destroyer man. He thought the range was too far. The moment of battle is scarcely the time for an admiral to begin quizzing his subordinates about their knowledge, but Admiral Wright did just that. 5 precious minutes passed, and the Japanese ships moved away from the Americans and past them. The moment was gone when the admiral finally gave the commander the go sign. The destroyers launched 20 torpedoes at the Japanese ships, but the range and angle were all wrong, and $200,000 worth of American weaponry went to the bottom of the sea without doing any damage. Finally, the American float planes gained enough altitude to begin their work. Their problem had been the glassy, windless surface of Tulagi Bay, that for precious minutes had kept them from getting the aerodynamic lift they needed to break the suction and take the planes off the water. They began dropping flares around the Japanese ships, which accomplished the purpose of lighting up Tanaka's destroyers without using telltale searchlights. The moment that Admiral Tanaka saw the first American cruiser, he gave his battle order close, and attack the Japanese did, although for a change they were at a slight disadvantage because of the flare of the American flares. Still, their shooting was good. The destroyer Takanami was the first to approach the Americans, and the first to fire her opening salvo struck an American ship, and her next 5 salvos also struck other ships. But by that time, Takan Army was in desperate trouble. The concentrated fire of the cruiser Minneapolis, the cruiser New Orleans, and several other ships fired on her repeatedly, until she was aflame and her guns had been destroyed. Apparently all the American ships were concentrating there. Fire on this one target, the flagship Naganami, was also in action. Her searchlight swept toward the Americans and caught an American cruiser. The light stopped and lingered on the cruiser's bridge. The Nagan army was running in the opposite direction, so she swung around and paralleled the cruiser course, firing her guns and readying her torpedoes at a range of 3 miles. She launched 8 torpedoes just before 11:30 a.m. 2 of them struck the cruiser Min Apis, Admiral Wright's flagship, sending such huge columns of water over the ship that the 8-in guns were silenced for a few moments. The guns regained power, but then the general power system failed, and the Minneapolis was out of the fight. Her captain concerned with the problems of keeping the damaged ship afloat. Another of Naganami torpedoes struck the cruiser New Orleans, which was trying to avoid a collision with the wavering Minneapolis, and blew up 2 forward magazines. The ship broke in 2, and the whole bow section slipped along the port side of what was left the New Olon, after guns the Pensacola and other American ships fired on the Naganami. A number of near misses gouged holes in her, but she did not take a single direct hit. Perhaps because she was traveling at top speed of 45 knots, the Japanese destroyers Oyashio and Kuroshio fired 10 torpedoes at American ships. One of them struck the cruiser Penn's Kola below the main M. She lost power and began to list, and her captain took her out of the fight and headed for Tulagi. Meanwhile, the American destroyers were again launching torpedoes, and the Japanese destroyer Suzuki Kazi was so busy turning to avoid them that she did not launch any of her own. The American heavy cruiser Northampton turned to avoid the 3 damaged vessels ahead of her and kept firing, but 2 of OAS's torpedoes struck her and opened her up as a can opener rips through a tin of beans she listed to port slowed and finally stopped. The American ships became thoroughly confused, and some were firing on each other. 2 of the destroyers had to leave the scene to avoid gunfire from crippled cruisers Al. Together, the action lasted almost half an hour, and then both sides began taking stock. Admiral Wright in the stricken Minneapolis gave up his command to Admiral Tisdale in the Honolulu, which went around Savu Island to try to find the Japanese. All he found was a destroyer landing troops on the beach at Guadalcanal that turned out to be one of the wrecked transports that Tanaka had run 2 weeks earlier. He steamed around Savu Island once more and found nothing. Admiral Tanaka pulled clear of the battle and called up the Takanami. She did not answer. He sent the Yashio and Koshio back to find her, and to see what help they could give. They did find her south of Cape. Esperance dead in the water. At about that time the Honolulu appeared, and the 2 Japanese destroyers fled, leaving the Takanami survivors in the water. Some of them made their way by small boat and raft to Guadalcanal, where they joined the troops, but 26 Japanese sailors and the ship's log were rescued by the Americans. Apparently the Honolulu never saw the Takanami or the 2 undamaged Japanese destroyers, and later Admiral Morrison wrote that the Takanami had sunk during the heat of the action with all hands. In any event, Admiral Tanaka had lost a ship. He assembled all the others around the flagship, and to his surprise discovered that not one of the other Japanese destroyers had suffered even a single direct hit, but they had fired all their torpedoes, and the supply destroyers did not have sufficient ammunition to engage in further action to do so, would not have been in accord with Japanese Navy doctrine anyhow, since the torpedoes were gone, and the Japanese placed a much higher value on the destroyers as torpedo platforms than did the Americans at that time. The battle the Japanese called the Night Battle of Longa, and the Americans called the Battle of Tassafaronga, was over. Admiral Tanaka had not fulfilled his supply mission, but had inflicted one of the most stunning defeats of the war in terms of relative strengths of forces employed with nothing but destroyers. He had sunk the cruiser Northampton. She was abandoned that night and caused serious damage to 3 other American cruisers, while losing a single destroyer. The Minneapolis and the New Orleans had to be sent back to the United States for repairs, and were out of action for nearly a year. The Pensacola had to go back to Pearl Harbor, and she also was out of action until October 1943 in post-mortem. The American admirals tried to figure out what had gone wrong. They had many explanations: surprise, the lack of military training with this task force, the numerical inferiority of the American destroyers. But the truth was that the Americans conducted a sloppy battle. The float planes did not do their job, and the destroyers did not do theirs. The marksmanship of the cruiser gunners, who fired hundreds of salvos, was dismal. In the final analysis, it added up to a well-known story: in night fighting tactics, the Japanese were far superior to the Americans. They had already had much more practice, and Admiral Tanaka's destroyers worked as a team. But that was not the real answer. The Japanese had a better conceptual use of the destroyers in night actions than the Americans, and were thus much more effective in fighting. The Americans could take some pride in improvement of their damage control methods. They saved 3 of the cruisers, but the end result was a stunning victory for the Japanese.